presenter today. Means I've got all the questions and none of the answers. So I hope we are going to get some great responses from the panel. But with that, I'm going to hand over to our host to give us some opening remarks. So please welcome to the podium, Francisco Mingorance, Secretary General of Cloud Infrastructure Service Providers in Europe.
Is this thing working? Yes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dear panelists, I'm really impressed by the quality of this panel, and I'm very excited to hear more and participate in the discussion if possible. So, having welcomed you here, I hope you all had a good lunch, a good dessert, and I was tasked to let's say warm up the room a little bit and set a bit of a few ideas to liven up this debate. So I will try to do just that, and I will try to stick to what my colleagues want me to say to the most possible. So, but it's good to be here, and I've seen a lot of familiar faces, especially being I would say an old timer or young timer for the Brussels bubble. So that feels good. New faces also, but you know, maybe we'll meet during the day. So what I'd like to say is that our organization is mostly composed of European. The vast majority are European cloud providers. Sometimes they are the national leaders in the market. Most of the time they are smaller SMEs, and I didn't expect them to be interested. Maybe the bigger members like AWS, you know, I was expecting a lot more interest from them, but not so much from the smaller player. And when we asked the question, I mean, does this you know, network fees or network levy, as we call it, bother you? I was very surprised that they all came back. Many of them came back and said, this is extremely problematic for us. And one of the CEOs of our CSP provider says, even this is one of the biggest threats to the European cloud industry. So that's, I guess, explains why we are here today and why the topic is extremely important for our sector. So, and for those of you like me who have been young timers, old timers in the bubble, in the Brussels bubble, this debate has a sense of déjà vu. Some years, maybe 10 years ago, you know, we had this debate on net neutrality, and at that time already, this debate was threatening some of the basic principles of the open internet. We had a lot of ink on, you know, deep packet inspection technologies and how this would have to be used to ensure network neutrality. And so when this discussion about network traffic levies came up, not only was there a sense of déjà vu, but also we all felt that it would be best if this thing can go away. So then my colleagues wanted me to poke the Commission for not being available today, but I'm going to skip that since we want to you know, work with them. That's the name of the game in this town. So we are open for business, and we look forward to, you know, engaging in the coming weeks and months. And so I will just to help start the discussion, recap some of the CISPE position on the network fee debate. So our main point is that cloud providers are not generating traffic, and therefore they should never be captured or considered in the scope of any traffic levy. So that's our starting point. And so more concretely, charging cloud provider for the traffic they carry would have significant consequences on customers and users, and also on Europe goals for the digital decade and sustainability. This is the main topic and the hardcore discussion. And I have 5 comments I want to deliver, and then I'm going to shut up. So the first, so any levy, by definition, and unfortunately due to the nature of the business, any levy will most probably trickle down to the end user, which means they would be the one financing such tax. So that's a point I want to make very clear, no matter what happens. Second, if we have higher prices for cloud customers, including business and all end user, this also means a slower uptake of cloud services in Europe. And that again is in direct contradiction with the digital decade goals and the digitalization target that the Commission has set forward. So there is a bit of a contradiction here. Maybe, you know, if the Commission was here, they could help reconcile that, but maybe for another discussion. And also, I mean, we also committed as a sector, the cloud sector, to achieve climate neutrality by 2030. I think we are the first sector who has made that pledge. The regulator is coming up with new regulation, but that pledge is already made. And it is made because modern cloud computing infrastructure enable energy efficiency and you know, better use of resources, recycling, etc. That is hardly found in more legacy you know, data center and on-premise systems. So that's my second point. There is also a third point, which is about competition. Telecom operators in Europe also compete with us in terms of providing cloud computing services to their customer. And a network levy fee could lead to, let's say, tilting the balance and creating an uneven level playing field. Telco could be incentivized with such fee to raise interconnection price and drive out competition. So, you know, that's a risk. My fourth point is simply pointing back to the existing experience that we know of in Korea, and I'm sure that Petra and Bart will, you know, take this up as an example of, you know, what works and what doesn't work. And finally, what I'd like to stress is that cloud and CDN providers have contributed enormously to a more efficient connectivity network in Europe. And as I'm sure David will note, such investments already save telecom operators billions of euros, and it will continue to do so in the coming years with more investments. So to sum up, we consider that this internet traffic levy proposal are dangerous for the open internet, and we would prefer if the idea goes away. However, if the Commission thinks that you know, this idea has leg and will push for it, it is crucial that intermediaries such as cloud providers are clearly exempted from the scope of the regulation in order to safeguard competition and pursue and achieve the Europe Digital's Decade and sustainability goal. So in conclusion, I think what is important here is that we have an open and fact-based debate, which is not always the case in some of these you know, legislative debate. And also I want to stress that telecom operator and cloud provider already cooperate in many different ways. And Carlos, I want to thank you for, you know, joining this panel. It's an adversarial panel, and so it should be interesting. But it shows that there is a way to find common solutions and share objectives. So I really welcome your participation. So with that being said, and in the spirit of an open and, you know, interesting and fact-based discussion, I'd like to again thank you for joining, and thank you very, very much. And I'm looking forward to a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you can see, we have a very packed panel. We're going to start with a round of opening remarks from our speakers. I know David has also got some slides presented to give you a little bit of his background. And then, as I say, we'll go into some questions from me and hopefully a lot of questions from the audience, whether in the room here or on Slido. So please don't forget to do that. So let me introduce you to David Abecassis, partner at Analysys Mason. Next, we have Kostas Masselos, who is chair of the Body of European Regulators for Electronic Communications, or BEREC. Bart van der Sloot is managing director of Leaseweb Network. That's the operating company in the Leaseweb group that looks after the IP connection for Leaseweb's operating companies in Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific. And he's also chair of the board of the Amsterdam Internet Exchange, because he doesn't have enough work to do. Petra is a senior manager at public policy at Cloudflare and responsible for policy engagement at the EU level. And last but not least, Carlos Rodríguez Cocina is director of EU affairs and head of the Brussels office of Telefónica. So I think, David, let's start with you. You've got some slides ready. Let's have a look at your presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you all hear me properly? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to Francisco and the team at CISPE for having me. I have a few slides. The brief that I was given was to try and demystify a little bit what CDNs do and why they're important, and the link with what we're talking about today, which is cloud infrastructure. And there are interesting synergies between cloud and CDNs that hopefully will be clear in the slides that I have. A bit of background: I'm a partner in Analysys Mason. We're a TMT-focused consulting firm. I have worked on this topic for the last sort of year and a half since really it kicked off. And some of the remarks that I'll make draw on some of the analysis that we've done. So Francisco alluded to that. So just to start, if we think about how data or data traffic, however we want to call it, flows over the public internet, the way in which the internet is designed is by nature decentralized. And so these traffic flows, if you don't do anything to them, are really best effort, and they're not controlled end to end. So if you're exchanging traffic between a point A and a point B, you normally don't control what happens between A and B. And that's great for a lot of reasons. So as I think you all know, the internet was initially conceived to withstand nuclear war. Hopefully we're nowhere close to that, but part of the founding principles of the internet are to be able to withstand any sort of holes in the middle, as it were. What CDNs do is they try to control some of that chain of delivery in order to take some of the uncertainty away from the quality of the connection between A and B. And today, when we look at CDNs, and I think Bart will explain what he does in the CDN space, and so will Petra, but we talk about CDNs in the context of a lot of different things. Corporate traffic is one example. Cloud traffic is a sub-example of that. Gaming companies use CDNs and indeed own CDNs, and obviously video streaming is a big user of CDNs. In addition to controlling some of the network that enables the content to be delivered from A to B, a CDN may also do other things like caching content closer to the end user. And what that allows is for less of the network to be used every time a user asks for the same piece of content. And these caches can be in peering points, public or private peering points, or they can also be fairly deep in the network of ISPs. And Francisco alluded to some work that we've done where we've quantified the benefits of these caches, and we estimate that for Europe, the cost saving to ISPs of being able to cache traffic closer to end users is, and that's a conservative estimate, in excess of €1 billion a year, roughly. So not insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Cloud infrastructure, because this is what we're concerned about today, is typically accessible over the public internet and over a variety of CDNs. So some of these CDNs are more traditional commercial CDNs. Some of them are operated by the cloud infrastructure providers themselves, and others are of a different nature. So some of the options that are available to enterprises to connect to public cloud infrastructure in particular are very close-knit technical relationships with ISPs. So Azure Express is an example, for example. And cloud providers are investing heavily, and again, Francisco, you alluded to that, in increasingly localized infrastructure. So I've, given that AWS is a member of CISPE, I've taken the liberty of showing their footprint. They today have 31 launch regions and a bunch of other regions currently in development, 99 availability zones, and a vast number of points of presence, which are effectively their CDNs. What we see in Europe is an increasing investment in cloud regions in pretty much all the big European countries today, and we expect this trend to continue. These investments stack up. So on the top right here, I've shown a global number, which is in the region of $120 billion annually over the last 4 or 5 years. In Europe, this number is, we estimate, is in excess of 30 billion a year at the moment. And if we think about what cloud services will enable in the future, and that's something that we at Analysys Mason do a lot of work on, is help with delivering network services. And in that context, you would expect cloud-like infrastructure to be closer and closer to the access network of operators, and to be deeply intertwined with them. Now, cloud customers and ISPs both benefit from decentralized traffic delivery, including through CDNs. You know, something that I think we'll talk about again today is the fact that cloud infrastructure providers create economies of scale and scope for smaller content providers in a way that they couldn't access themselves if they had to operate their own infrastructure. And what we're seeing increasingly is even deep caching infrastructure being available to cloud users, and all the benefits that this entails. So I won't go into these details, but the benefits that are visible today from CDNs include reduced latency, which will be important if 5G industrial applications take off, lower bandwidth demand and savings, particularly for video streaming, as well as other benefits around scale and scope. And here we've called out first the very mutually beneficial relationships that exist between CDNs, cloud providers, and telcos today, and also some of the benefits that smaller companies can get from being able to use the specialized skills of companies like Cloudflare, for example, in terms of security and so forth. I'll stop here. Hopefully I didn't overrun too much. And I'll pass on to Kostas, I think.
Yes, indeed. Kostas, you're here as the regulator representative on the panel. So give us some opening remarks and set the scene from your perspective.
Thank you, Jennifer, and many thanks to CISPE for inviting me. Many thanks to CISPE for having me here as a speaker today. I think it's more than a year now that I have been participating to discussions about fair share or fair contribution or network usage fees or whatever it is called. And maybe I will sound boring again, but I would like in my opening remarks to discuss the context where this discussion about network usage fees takes place. So in European Union, in the context of the Digital Decade Policy Program, we defined some very ambitious ICT objectives. So by 2030, these include digital transformation of public sector, of enterprises, development of digital skills for European citizens. These include adoption of cloud services, of AI technology as well. And in these objectives, there are also some infrastructure objectives: computing, semiconductors, connectivity. With regards to connectivity, the objectives are indeed very ambitious. 1 gigabit per second connectivity for all users in Europe by 2030, 100% population coverage by wireless networks, at least equivalent to 5G by 2030. And I can tell that in discussions we had with regulators and other stakeholders in other regions of the world, some of our objectives sound indeed too ambitious. For example, I remember in BEREC study trip 2022 in Washington, we had discussions there about this ambition of Europe to have 1 gigabit per second connectivity everywhere for all users. And they said they are fighting for 100 megabits per second, in particular to certain areas. So this is indeed, I think this is indeed very, very ambitious. And of course, we should not forget the sustainability objective. So not only we want fast networks, we want also energy efficient networks and minimize the environmental footprint of the networks and also of the other ICT infrastructure. So these are the objectives. What is the status today? Based on information from public data, for example, the 5G Observatory report. Today, we see that we have 5G services in all European Union member states, at least to part of each European Union member state. This is based on the 5G Observatory report of October 2022. And we have population coverage above 70%. Today, it might be even larger after 6 months from the report I refer to. So 5G deployment progresses well. With regards to FTTH deployment, fiber networks deployment, we have coverage above 50% in Europe already. And I think soon we will have updated coverage results from the Commission in the context of the broadband coverage report of 23. But if we compare this to other regions in the world, I always try to do comparisons, to be honest. And then I see the following. For example, if I consider countries like China and South Korea, the number of 5G base stations per 100,000 inhabitants is much higher in these countries and smaller, lower in Europe. And on top of that, in Europe, most 5G base stations use dynamic spectrum sharing to allow them use 4G bands to offer 5G services. So this means that in Europe, we might do a little bit better to take advantage of the full potential of 5G technology with regards to our network deployments. And also, the penetration of 5G services is, according to the 5G Observatory report, is lower in Europe compared to other countries, other areas. The same is true with regards to fiber deployments. There are countries with much higher coverage and, even more important, much higher penetration. United Arab Emirates, Singapore, and again, China and South Korea. So this is where we are today with regards to the networks. In the context of this discussion, a key point, in my opinion, is the investment gap, whether we face an investment gap or not. And in the exploratory consultation text of the European Commission, we saw an estimate, 174 billion euros investment needs or investment gap to achieve our 2030 objectives. If we have to face these challenges, and if we want to achieve our objectives, of course, we need policy and regulatory intervention. First thing is to create an environment which may attract investments, which is friendly for investments, and a regulatory framework that optimizes costs for networks deployment, very high capacity networks deployment. And at the same time, in my opinion, we should also address the demand side. Of course, we want to build networks, but we want these networks first to be financially viable in the long run, and of course, accessible to the citizens, to the end users. So to offer services that are competitively priced. So this should be our objectives. In this context, BEREC aims at contributing, of course, to the discussion about achieving the objectives of the Digital Decade Policy Program with policy and regulation proposals. BEREC has a threefold strategy to support full connectivity for Europe, to support open and sustainable digital markets, and to empower end users. So in this context, BEREC submitted proposals with regards to the connectivity package presented by the European Commission in February. So we presented our opinion on the gigabit recommendation, which is also an important regulatory intervention, our analysis of the Gigabit Infrastructure Act, and of course, our position in the exploratory consultation with regards to the future networks and connectivity in Europe, etc. So I would stop at this point my opening remarks, and I think in following discussion, I will have the chance to present in some more details BEREC's position in the exploratory consultation.
Thank you very much, Kostas. Bart, I know you're going to give a bit of the historical context because it's important to know where we've got, but do tell us, what is the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah, let me explain. First of all, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for to invite me to this panel. To give a bit of context, so my day-to-day job is at Leaseweb. We're a Dutch cloud infrastructure services provider, so a hosting company providing services in 30 data centers around the world, Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific. But what does that mean, a hosting provider? So basically what we do, we put our servers and our network equipment in a data center. We connect that to the internet, typically by procuring IP transit services from 3 networks. And these are the companies like Lumen Technologies, Aurelion, formerly known as Telia, Cogent Communications. And then we look at other options to optimize connectivity through peering in the area with networks who are willing to peer with us. And I'll come back to that later. And so on a day-to-day basis, I'm really involved in IP interconnection. My team negotiates with all these networks. And I'm probably one of the few persons in the room who does not specialize in public policy, but just has its feet in the mud to get things done. Yeah, first, coming back to your comment, I struggle to understand what problem we're trying to solve and if there actually is a problem. On one hand, if I look at all the infrastructure players in the value chain, that's hosting companies like us, it's CDNs like Cloudflare, it's tier 1 networks, it's access networks. If I look at their financials, then my conclusion is that all these companies spend about 15 to 20% of their revenues in CapEx to expand capacity. And so if all the players in the infrastructure value chain spend a similar percentage of revenue on CapEx, why should one pay the other? And for me, the logics of sending network party pays is as logic as pulling network party pays. Because you can say, okay, all these content providers send content to an internet user, but from our perspective, we have all these internet users pulling content from our servers, which has a cost to us. So I think actually the investments in infrastructure are fairly distributed through the whole ecosystem. So that's definitely not an argument to support sending network party pays. Then you can argue, yes, there is growth in data traffic. There is also continuous growth in peak bandwidth, because at the end of the day, the cost of a network are not driven by the amount of data which is distributed in a network. It's more determined by the peak bandwidth that you need to have available when there's Formula 1 races or when there's football matches or anything that happens on the internet, which could create a peak in bandwidth. And this is also where it gets a bit fuzzy, because of course, when we look at the Ethno report, the Exxon report from Ethno and other sources, you could say, oh, but we need to keep investing so much in expanding bandwidth capacity in our networks. But there's also reports that indicate the other ways around. And if you would actually look at the investor relations presentations from many of these large carriers, you could actually conclude that the cost of bandwidth is declining, and the cost per gigabyte is actually declining faster than the growth in bandwidth. And this was actually a quote from a report from Vodafone. And so I'm really struggling to understand if there is a problem, and if there is really a problem that we need additional investment in all that access infrastructure, access network infrastructure. If you calculate the 20 billion per year that was in the original Exxon Ethno report, that was expected to be contributed by the large, let's say, hyperscalers. If you calculate that back to increased monthly fees of a broadband connection at home or a mobile service, at least in my mathematics, I get to €2 to €3 per month on top of the existing fees, which in many cases or many countries in Europe is less than what they increase on an annual basis anyway. And so for me, it's more logical that each player in the ecosystem carries its own investment, and there should not be a financial transaction between those networks just to carry the investment of another player in the ecosystem. If I go back a little bit in the historical perspective, I started in this industry back in 1999 at a company called Global Crossing. This was one of the first tier 1 global internet backbones. That company was acquired by Level 3 Communications, one of its larger competitors. and it's currently known as Lumen Technologies. So this is one of the largest tier 1 internet backbones. And back in the early days, the internet was very simple. There were people who were running an access network, and there were content providers or hosting providers. Both of them needed access to the internet, so both would procure IP transit services from a company like Global Crossing. Both would pay Global Crossing for that internet access. But of course, then people started looking at optimize the cost base of their operations. So we saw a number of things. We saw access networks building out international networks to get closer to that content, and in an attempt to lower their cost, to make it cheaper than buying these IP transit services. We also saw hosting companies build international network to bring that content closer to this access network. Like in my case, Leaseweb, most of our content is based in Amsterdam. So we started building connections to Frankfurt, London, and then connect there to the local internet exchanges to exchange content with the networks in that area. And more recent, and we saw a third actually development as well. And this is where some large European, typically incumbent players said, hey, this tier 1 market seems to be interested. Let me just go and invest in trying to become a tier 1 and a huge global network as well. As we saw huge investment in global capacity, transatlantic connections from a number of European players who wanted to become that tier 1 network. And one of my observations is that it's especially those players that are now trying to seek financial contributions to their local access networks. And so typically the larger players in Germany, Spain, Italy, France, those were the companies that really invested in building these huge global backbones. And they're now leading the discussion in trying to get financial contribution to their access networks in their countries. Yeah, so more recently, we of course have seen content and applications moving even closer to these access networks. CDNs play a large role. Hyperscalers, of course, invest tremendously in building capacity closer to these access networks. So there's a lot of stuff going on to actually minimize the cost of access networks and bring content and application closer to their networks. And that's why, yeah, I believe that the whole principle of sending network party pays doesn't really make any sense. And that's probably where I should stop now and hand over to Petra.
Yes, indeed. Petra, I'm sure you'll probably echo some of what Bart's been saying, but give us the Cloudflare perspective on traffic fees.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks CISPE also for inviting me as a non-member to be on the panel. So thank you very much. Yeah, I don't want to risk repeating a lot of what Bart has said, and also I think what Francisco has said in the beginning. But one of the things that I wanted to focus on here, speaking from the CDN perspective, is actually resilience of the internet. At Cloudflare, we are a CDN, but we also provide a number of very important security services, including DDoS protection services, zero trust security services for companies, but also for NGOs, for individuals that run their own website, for basically anybody who needs very secure and also very fast connections for their users to reach their online business or their online properties. And one of the things that we believe very much is that a resilient and secure internet is the backbone for all those businesses to basically work and to basically take advantage of everything that digitalization has to offer. And so one of the things that we see and what we fear with a sender party pays or network users fees proposal is that that would actually disincentivize increasing interconnection between different networks, and that would actually then risk security, also resilience in terms of having different traffic routes that would ease congestion and actually help in terms of bringing content faster, but also in a less costly way to the end users. We have, I think, overall invested a lot in our interconnection relationships with ISPs, but also in our global presence in terms of our points of presence that we have all around the world. we actually announced this week that we passed the 12,000 network connections mark, which is, I think, quite impressive. And we're present also in over 300 locations worldwide in terms of our points of presence. So the fact that, as David was explaining, what we do is try to bring content closer to the end user. We try to make sure that everything is as localized as possible, which saves costs both for our customers, but also for the access networks, which, it saves bandwidth costs. It doesn't have, traffic, it doesn't have to go all around the world from one particular server to the end user every time. We use, obviously, caching technology for that. To make sure that specifically also, video content and other kind of very, let's say, heavy traffic does not have to travel very far over a number of different access networks. So what CDNs do is indeed caching this content locally. So I think there's from our perspective a very much mutual beneficial relationship between telecom networks and CDNs. We see that as an advantage that CDNs can actually deliver a long number of benefits for ISPs. So one of the things that we then fear with the network usage fees proposal is that you would create artificial costs in the system that it currently doesn't exist, or largely doesn't exist. Most of the peering globally is done on a settlement-free basis. There is no such kind of concept, except for South Korea, as was mentioned before, of kind of mandated paid peering arrangement set by regulation. And we've seen what the effects can be in Korea. From our perspective, we have seen an impact on latency mostly for our customers if serving traffic only through transit from outside of South Korea. We've seen, specifically for our free user segment, we have seen a increase in latency of 187%, which is one of the measurements we've done last year, specifically for South Korea. So there is that kind of fear that we have, is the impact on latency, the impact on resilience of the internet. If you try to introduce kind of differences between a fast lane, let's say, for large content providers that would be forced into paid agreements or forced into negotiation, let's say, with large European ISPs, and then a kind of slower lane for everybody else, which would then, increase, increase basically the cost for everybody else, but also have an impact on latency, have impact on resilience, because the traffic routes are diminished, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one of the main impacts that we are fearing is very much that interconnection is disincentivized, and it's seen as something that is not actually beneficial to increase and to kind of peer with each other and do all these interconnections. And as you were explaining, Bart, from the practical perspective, that's a win-win situation for the whole internet. This is how the internet has set up, and this is how it functions in the best way. And we would fear that introducing a system of payments for certain providers and kind of shaking up the system, even if it's just a couple of companies that would be kind of captured, it would have a knock-on effect on everybody else in terms of costs for, that would go up for interconnection, for transit in the market, but also in terms of, the innovation and also the kind of solutions that CDNs can bring. It would be more costly for us. It would be more costly for cloud providers and everybody else in the ecosystem, including our customers and also the end users of the ISPs. That's at least the fear that we have if we would go through with this proposal.
Thank you, Petra. No, you cannot. Because I think, I may be wrong, Carlos, but I suspect here's where the consensus on the panel is about to end. So
So thank you, Jennifer, and thank you very much for the invitation to Telefónica to be here today. And I agree that it's always better to have some diversity in views and opinions, and it's more colorful and usually more fun and instructive for everybody. So you will not be surprised if I make some statements that will be thought-provoking and differ from the line that we have been hearing in the panel. But I think that to understand the position of Telefónica and the telco operators in the first debate, is important to take a step back. And Kostas was pointing to this before. We have two important political objectives from the European Commission that we have to consider. One of them is the digital compass, so the achievement of the 2030 targets, in particular for connectivity. I will not repeat them because Kostas already mentioned them. Very challenging, as he was commenting. But the other one that is well known but less mentioned frequently is the strategic autonomy objective. And this is related to reducing our dependencies in Europe, and particularly in the digital space, being able to develop our own capacities and capabilities, a very important one as well. So when you look into the European telecom sector and our ability to contribute to achieve these objectives, what you find is a sector that has been declining in revenues for the last 10 years. It's a sector where return on investment is lower than the cost of capital. And it's a sector where financial markets do not believe anymore. And basically our stock market performance is really poor during the last years. So the value is getting out of the telecom sector. Under these financial dire straits, it's very difficult to think that we will be able to contribute to bridge the investment gap that Kostas was mentioned, and with this figure of 174 billion that in the last speech from Commissioner Breton we heard augmented to 200 billion, with the bulk of it coming to or having to come from the private sector. And I was curious about the remark from Bart that everybody is doing their part, which is true. Our capex to revenues percentage is between 15–20%, but perhaps you have to consider the volumes. We're talking about investments that go over 50 billion euros per year from the telecom sector. So that means more than 500 billion euros investment in infrastructure in the last 10 years, which is a huge effort and still not enough to get us into these 2030 targets. So on the side of competitiveness and strategic autonomy, there are opportunities. And it's true that probably during the years, you have heard the telco sector mainly complaining about regulation and mainly complaining and crying about how this is stifling our opportunities. Now we see a big field of opportunities with Web3, with the immersive internet experience, augmented reality, virtual reality. But all of these opportunities that are up let's say, to grab for us depend on a number of factors. We have to invest heavily in 5G standalone, so the real 5G that will come with all the features that are needed for the most innovative services. We have to probably invest in edge computing. We have to develop the technologies that will ensure the low latency that many of these services will require, and the quality and the resilience. So this is an element that goes with transformation of the network and virtualization of the network functions, a number of things that are correctly addressed in the consultation from the European Commission in the first part of the consultation. So I think this gives us a context, and if we are not able to reach or bridge the gap in terms of investment, and we are not able to get there in terms of developing the capabilities for strategic autonomy and grab the opportunities that are ahead of us, it's logical, I think, that the European Commission is wondering what to do. What can we do to make sure that we achieve these targets? And in this context, the telecom sector in Europe comes with FAIRShare as one of the proposals to address this issue, not the only one, but one of them. And I would say that really from a very basic number of facts that I will comment to you right now. The first one, only a handful of players, about 5 or 6 players, are generating more than 50% of the traffic that we carry in our networks. And this is mainly related to video streaming. Video streaming is about 75 or 80% of the total traffic in the internet. So one fact. Second fact, traffic is growing, and is growing on a 25 to 30% average on a year-by-year basis. And the growth of traffic comes with cost. I would differ with Bart here, because we see it. I mean, if you have to dimension your network to cope with this traffic, you need capacity. You have to buy more spectrum. You have to densify the networks. You have to install more antennas. So there are costs associated to the growth in traffic. And the third fact, and this is very interesting, is that there is a decoupling between the growth of traffic and our revenues that as I was mentioning, are declining, stagnant. Perhaps you can see now, due to inflation and consideration of inflation, a little bit of a markup, but really a very, very interesting decoupling where we are not able to monetize all this growth of traffic in our networks. No? So a very curious situation. So under these circumstances, what we have realized is that, in fact, we are providing a service, a very important service, to these large traffic generators in particular, to deliver the traffic that they let's say, pass on to us to our customers with the capillarity of our access network. And that service so far is not being paid for in most of the case. So this is what we find irregular or not normal. And when we ask, let's sit down and negotiate the price for this service that we are providing to you, the answer that we get is there is nothing to negotiate. You are benefiting from my content because this is what gives value to your infrastructure. And this is what allows you to set and to sell your services to your customers. So when we hear frequently about this idea of where is the market failure, I don't see it, where is the novelty that you're trying to talk about, here is the market failure. If you are providing a service and the price of the service is zero and you try to monetize it and you're not able to do it because there is a lack of bargaining power on your end or an asymmetric situation with those that are passing the traffic to you, we have a market failure, and we need, I think, to address this market failure and make sure that we can get an economic compensation for this service. So this is, let's say, the very basic premise. We are seeing ourselves as matchmakers between our end users and the content providers in a two-sided market that is very well known as a formula in the digital space and many other areas. And we are not monetizing one part of the market. If we are only depending on the revenues of our end users, the situation will not improve, because politically, from a competitive perspective, I think it's unthinkable to raise prices in a very meaningful way on the end user side. So either we find a new way to generate revenues and resources for us, or we will not be in a position to contribute to accomplish those political objectives. And this is really where the whole debate is coming from. I can elaborate why this is not a network fee and other elements afterwards, but this is the very basic of the position.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. It is refreshing. If I had €1 for every time I heard a telco complain about regulation, I could probably fund a network. Bart, I'm apologizing. You can make your points now.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment about Korea, because one of my concerns is if such a sending network party pay scheme or a traffic tax would be introduced, that it would increase the cost base on the application services hosting side, and that may actually decrease the opportunities for innovation and new services. And I think one of the examples in Korea was that as a result of this traffic tax, Twitch decided to stop servicing Korean users. And I don't know the details in Korea, but I think it's an example that for some business models, introducing a traffic tax simply kills the business case. And in this example, gamers that were trying to send their streams to people in Korea so they can watch the game, that service is no longer available.
David, you wanted to jump in with a few points in reaction to our speakers, but then I do take it forward then from your sort of fairly independent perspective about what a fee might mean for, or how it might impact cloud and CDN providers.
Thanks. Yes, I think, I mean, it's a complicated topic, and I think every point that everybody on the panel made can be discussed on its own separate panel. I think the point I wanted to add is just listening to everyone. What it seems to me is that one of the things we should be discussing as well is not just whether a fee is a good or a bad thing. I mean, I have pretty strong views about that, as Carlos knows, tend to align more on the views expressed by Bart and Petra. But I think we can go beyond that and think about what it would mean if there was such a fee and how it could work in practice. And this is something that I think is difficult to envisage. And I mean, there was a recent paper that I think Telefónica sponsored from Compass Lexicon, which made an interesting point, which I noted, which is that traffic-related payments are easiest to negotiate, as traffic can be observed, monitored, and verified, and properly calibrated per unique traffic fees can provide telecoms operators with the appropriate incentive and solve the underinvestment problem. I mean, we can debate whether that's true or not, but there's two things I wanted to kind of pick on that. I think one is a point that did come across in the remarks, which is that very few network costs are directly driven by traffic. I think typically the bottlenecks tend to be bandwidth related. And so, of course, there's a relationship between bandwidth and traffic, but I think if we try to measure traffic because it's convenient, we may not fully address the problem of bandwidth limitations. So that's something that I think is interesting to discuss. And the second point that I wanted to make, and which is more of a nearly a philosophical point, which is that in the description that Petra in particular made of what Cloudflare does, there are tens of thousands of relationships, right? I think you said 12,000. And these tens of thousands of relationships are exist for every network who peers across the world with other networks. So there are millions, tens of millions of such relationships. And I think what's, at least in the complex lexicon paper, and I appreciate that's their view, right? It's not, I'm not trying to say it's anybody on the panel's view, but in that sort of view of the world, if that's the way it's implemented, I think we go towards something that looks like a settlement regime, and that looks very much like international telephony look like, and so forth. And that makes what today is very much a sector that's developed on its own based on individual incentives, kind of coalescing into investments where it made sense for people like Bart to invest, into something that's more telco-like. That might be a good thing or a bad thing. I think it'd be useful to understand, but something where there's a lot more frictions, however way you look at it. If you start having a measurement interface and a settlement interface, you have more frictions. And I take your point around the fact that maybe only 5 or 6 players would be affected. So maybe it won't be tens of millions of relationships, but the complexity to me still seems significant. And is that what we want as well in terms of the broader digital picture? So do we want something that remains sort of internet-like, because that's been quite successful? I think we'll all agree that it's been quite successful in handling the diversity and diversification of services that are being developed, that are being delivered online, and the scale that's come with that historically, right? So do we want to kind of really change this fundamentally and go towards a more, I'm going to say telco-like model, right? With no value judgment as to whether that might be good or bad, but something that's more like that? Or do we think that we can, that we should remain with a sort of let a thousand flowers bloom model? And these are open questions. I think I can see pros and cons.
Carlos, I'm sure you do want to respond.
Thank you. Fair enough, but what we are realizing is that actually that architecture of the thousands of exchanges of the hierarchical structure with the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 is now flattening, and is sort of being bypassed by these large traffic generators that are now developing their own submarine cables, power capabilities, data centers, CDNs. So somehow bypassing the traditional transit peering regime and just pumping the traffic directly to us. So this is a completely different reality. And I think that is very important, because we are not talking anymore about the traditional IP interconnection market that as Costas knows, is so far the focus of BEREC. I think we're trying to identify here a new reality that is different from how the traditional architecture of the internet has been working so far.
Bart, I see you grabbing the microphone, so I'm going to let you jump in again, even though we're jumping around a lot, but also because I see we've got a question from our audience to you directly, asking, is the low no payment mentioned by Telefónica because of bargaining power imbalances or something else? So make your points, but also if you could tackle that question too, please.
For me?
That was for you, Bart,
Okay,
actually.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the comment on market failure. Some of the access networks are struggling to negotiate with the big, let's say, big tech. I think most struggles are actually the other way around. If I want to serve content to an end user of Deutsche Telekom in Germany without any packet loss, then the only way for me to do that is to buy services directly from Deutsche Telekom. I have no bargaining power. So if you talk about market failure, there is no open competitive market to provide content to a specific access network, because by default, the owner of the network has the monopoly to serve content to the end user. So I think in general, if we're really discussing regulation which would serve the end user, it would, for me, make much more sense that access networks get the obligation to make sure there is unrestricted capacity to at least 3 tier 1 networks. similar to what is in place in the US in the open internet regulation, that to me would make much more sense and would generate much better quality for the end user than introducing the schemes that we're discussing here. And my big concern is also if we start introducing these schemes, we all spend a lot of time, a lot of cost on debates, on regulation, on fees, which from my perspective is a waste of time and money.
Kostas, let me bring you in because I know you're take a step back a little bit. We've spoken about it before. We know BEREC prepared a really detailed response to the Commission consultation. Could you give me a sort of overview of your main key points, but particularly with regard to European connectivity and European EU competitiveness as a whole?
Yeah, I think it's good to summarize the main points of BEREC's position in the exploratory consultation. We submitted our position in May, and we welcome the opportunity to respond to the consultation, which had a quite big range of topics and stakeholders involved in the discussion. We published our main position and also responses to part of the questions of the questionnaire of the consultation, plus some 2 annexes related to our main paper, and everybody can find this in our webpage. So BEREC's position, first of all, takes into consideration the Declaration on Digital Rights and Principles, and where it is mentioned that there should be a fair contribution by all beneficiaries of digital transformation to infrastructures for the funding of infrastructures. However, BEREC feels that this does not only concern the access network. So there are contributions in different parts of the network, like CDNs, submarine cables, data centers, even the content itself. So there are different contributions, not only the access part of the network. However, BEREC recognizes that the access part of the network is quite cost demanding. It's an important cost for network deployment. We already got the data of the exploratory consultation by the Commission, and we will analyze this data and also maybe quantitative assess our position with regards to this. We got the data very recently. So this is the part with regards to access network and contributions in different parts of ICT infrastructure, applications, and content. Now, with regards to the investment gap, we, as mentioned in my previous remarks, exploratory consultation has a starting point that there is an investment gap of 174 billion euros. BEREC has done no analysis of investment gap of its own. So looking at the pace of investments in very high capacity networks, one could say that there is no real danger or there is no real issue. On the other hand, in our analysis, and this is included in our position paper, we identify risks that for example, some of European citizens will not have access to 1 gigabit per second connectivity by 2030, or that we need additional investments indeed to achieve the digital decade policy program objectives of 2030. On top of that, we see differences in investment needs between member states. It's not the same across Europe. And there are also areas in Europe, like rural areas, where investments are more difficult to be made, and then we might need state aid intervention to deploy network infrastructure. BEREC also recognizes that the main source of revenues for the operators comes from residential and business users. And these revenues should be enough. If this is the main source of revenues for the telecom operators, these should be enough to support the deployment of network infrastructure. So these are the points with regards to investments. With regards to IP interconnection, it is true that our preliminary assessment paper focused on the IP interconnection. And again, we will see data received by the Commission's consultation and maybe assess again our position. Let me remind you that our new IP interconnection market report will be published in 24 for consultation and for approval. So it's work in progress. And it is true that during our preliminary assessment, we came to the conclusion that the sending party network-based mechanism would harm the internet ecosystem. This is written in our preliminary assessment paper. So any proposal for regulatory intervention, for new regulation, any policy discussion should be well justified, should have a very clear objective, and should have an impact analysis supporting the proposal. So impact analysis with regards to competition, innovation, end users, sustainability. And of course, we should always have in mind that any new regulatory proposal should be compliant with the Open Internet Regulation, and this is the cornerstone of electronic communications regulatory framework of Europe. So this summarizes BEREC positions in the exploratory consultation, and I would also like to take the opportunity about the case of South Korea, because in April, BEREC visited in the context of the annual study trip South Korea, and we had meetings with different stakeholders in South Korea. We have already published our study trip report. So we met small and medium enterprises, internet associations, academia, research centers, telecom operators, the Communications Commission of South Korea. The mandate is not one-to-one, it does not correspond one-to-one to our mandate in Europe, is more focused on end users and protection of end users. But we have also met the Ministry of Science and ICT, which is responsible for this legislation and regulation. There are different views, as you can imagine. And it all started in 2016 with sending party network pays among local ISPs. And then there have been 2 or 3 amendments to this one in 21, 22. But South Korean government, Ministry of Science and ICT, still preserve and amend this regulatory framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Petra, I want to bring you in because Kostas just mentioned there investment in infrastructure and innovation, but of course there are other areas to be considered, like reduced latency, security, resilience, and all these desirable outcomes. Give me, build on what you've heard from the other panelists saying, and give us your perspective on what might be the impact on those areas.
Yeah, I think also, as I said in my opening remarks, I think one of the things that we've seen specifically with regard to South Korea, obviously, because that's like the example that we have to refer to here, as what legislation or regulation could kind of have as an effect. I think the main thing that we have seen is the impact on latency, as I mentioned, for our customers. And I think that's true for a number of companies that are trying to bring content kind of closer to Korean users, and you were mentioning Twitch as well, and there's been others as well that have outlined the kind of effects that a South Korean legislation has had. I think that's one of the concerns that we would have if such a situation would kind of exist in Europe as well, so that there would be kind of no incentives anymore to try to bring that content closer to the end users of the ISPs, if the cost would be too high or to be too prohibitive to do direct peering, for example, direct connections to the access networks, which would mean that there would be obviously much more transit networks would be used much more, which would potentially increase there again an issue of resilience and congestion as well, because there would obviously be that kind of moving effect away from direct peering relationships if costs for everybody would go up, which is what we would expect would happen, even if there is not such a internet traffic tax for the whole ecosystem imposed, even if it's just a few companies. So I think we from our perspective, what we're trying to do is to help ISPs reduce costs by bringing that content locally, more local, by trying to reduce costs both for the sending party, but also for the receiving party. So if there would be an imbalance in the system, I think even just one measure like this would potentially, completely, change the current IP interconnection market as it has been existing for many, many decades. I think that, the consequences, we cannot really oversee everything, but that is some of the things that we would anticipate also based on what happened in Korea, but also just generally kind of knowing how the market works right now, and that it works very well for at least the majority of players in the ecosystem. It seems to be working very well. So we just are afraid of too many consequences for too many different sides, both consumers, small businesses, CDNs, cloud providers, and every smaller networks, everybody who is in the chain of delivering content to the end user.
Carlos, I'm going to come to you next because we've got a couple of questions coming in for you on Slido, and I will take this opportunity to remind everyone that there is a QR code on the papers in front of you if you want to use that tool, and to those online, please follow the link and ask your questions using that tool. We will also give you a moment in a few minutes to ask questions in the room if you wish, so get those prepared and be ready to put your hand up. Carlos, one question is, you mentioned that the levy is one solution among others needed to address the problems of EU telcos. What might be the other solutions? And also somebody else is making the point that Etno and GSMA, in their response to the consultation, list CDNs among those companies they think should be excluded from the fees, and wanting to know what's your view on that.
Let me address a number of things and these two questions as well, but just to respond briefly on South Korea, which to me is a little bit funny how we are all becoming experts in the situation in South Korea and in such a faraway market. But probably Kostas was right that there is a variety and diversity of opinions, and we were consulting recently with Korean telecom operators, and they have expressed their opinion in an article entitled very tellingly Myths and Truths about the IP interconnection system in South Korea. They claim that this is a very dynamic market, in particular for content production, that there are a number of local platform companies that are coming up, that there are a lot of dynamism, and that some of the established companies are increasing their investments in content production in South Korea. So they do not seem to believe that there is a consequence that as a result of the payment model, this is having, let's say, or spreading negative consequences for content production. And they have a number of other affirmations that are interesting, such as the fact that the South Korean government measures and publishes the quality of high-speed internet every year, and the speed broadband is increasing every year. So they seem to believe that the forefront position of Korea in the KPIs, which has been a poster child until now for all the connectivity measures, is still very much holding true. And I think it's very complex. I don't claim to be myself an expert on it, but when I read about it, I notice this difference between the payment mechanisms between ISPs and the fact that they seem to consider that content providers are not part of this category. They are users of the internet, and therefore they are under a paid regime, regulatorily established, but not under the payment regime existing between the ISPs. In any case, another argument that I think holds true for Europe as well, and to the comment of Bart of who is really abusing the market power, I think that the point is, if one of these large traffic generators goes to you and says, I'm getting the content closer to your end users, this is good, they will get better quality, lower latency, and so on. But I don't have an intention to pay you for that. We believe that that then the situation is complex, because the benefits that may come with this action of getting the content closer to our users come as well with cost associated to it. It's not that CDN's installation has no operating cost whatsoever for telco operators, and it's not that the problem of the dimensioning for the transit network and the investment in the access network disappears because part of the content is located in the CDNs. But to the questions and to the different solutions, if I can explain very briefly what we are proposing for the first solution and then address the question. So basically what we are calling for, yes, is a legislative proposal or a regulation, but a very basic one where we would like to see an obligation for the large traffic generators, and I will explain this category now, to sit down and negotiate a fair price with the telco operators for the conveyance of the traffic and the delivery of the traffic to our end users. So there would be, let's say, a right on our side to tell them, let's sit down and negotiate, an obligation for them to sit down and negotiate, but this would happen on a commercial basis. If there is an agreement in terms of what should be the fair and reasonable price, end of the problem. If there is no agreement, what we're calling for is an arbitration mechanism where a competent authority would step in and decide in a model of final offer arbitration which one of the two prices put on the table is the correct one, probably based on some guidance mechanism established by the European Commission, for instance, in terms of what are the factors that should determine what is the fair and right price, the accomplishment of the 2030 objectives, the costs that are generated in the traffic, and you are able to show that exist, this kind of factor. So we see this really as a simple market-driven solution that hopefully is much less intrusive than the representations that are appearing elsewhere. But you're right, at the end, the important thing is the scope and identify who are these large traffic generators. Our proposal is to use a threshold that would be based on a 5% of the traffic in our networks aggregated on a yearly basis, peak hour time traffic. Those companies that would be above those thresholds would be large traffic generators and would be obliged by this regulatory provision. The companies that are below the threshold have no obligation. Intermediaries such as CDNs are not affected by this proposal, because what we are talking about here is about the traffic generators. So in CDNs, there can happen two things. The CDN may be a proprietary facility of one of these large traffic generators, and then the traffic that is funneled through the CDN counts. So the traffic will still count. Or CDNs may be used by a number of different players, and therefore only the traffic associated to the traffic generators would count. But as such, the CDNs are not included in the scope of the proposal that we are making. And just a final quick word on other solutions that we're thinking about. I think these are more well-known. One of them is the fragmentation in the market, so the need for scale and consolidation, which is a long-gone discussion, but is still very relevant these days, where we see the importance of gaining a scale first in market, so at the national level, before tackling what could be a cross-border or pan-European consolidation. So we believe that there is a part of the negative situation of the telecom sector in Europe is due to much fragmentation in the market, which is part of the things that we need to tackle. The other one is the overall regulatory approach to the sector, things about the need for a more pro-investment spectrum policy, the need for a less intrusive sort of regulatory approach towards the access networks, a number of the more classic, let's say, I would say, claims of the sector.
Classic is a very nice way of putting it. Classic as in we've been talking about this for 10 years in some of the cases of fragmentation. David, I'm interested to get your perspective on some of the suggestions there that Carlos is making, particularly a market-driven solution with some sort of arbitration. What would be your view on that? What do you see as the speed bumps around that or potential benefits?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky, and Carlos and I have discussed it before. I think you know, today there isn't really any regulation that applies to the interface between content providers and telcos. There's a general requirement under the Open Internet Regulation not to block traffic or unfairly degrade traffic in the context of a generally available internet access service to end users. And Kostas can correct me if I say something wrong. so we've had certain things like all the open internet regulations, and not today, right? But the open internet regulation prevents these fair negotiations and so forth. But the reality is that many countries in the world don't have these regulations, and you know, the outcomes are not that different. The only country which has effectively the sort of fees that we're talking about in a different context is South Korea. As far as I know, in any other market, it's freely negotiated. Sometimes there's paid peering arrangements. I think CISPE in France provides statistics on the balance of paid and free peering arrangements, and I think around half the traffic is subject to paid peering. So these mechanisms exist, and so it's kind of hard for me to kind of understand how, in Carlos's suggestions, it would not go to a final offer arbitration that would effectively force a third party to make a judgment on what the right level is. So I think this is what, at least in my work and in my thinking, I've been projecting to that level, to that point, right? Because it's kind of hard to think how that would be avoided with those mechanisms. And I think, I mean, irrespective of the level of the fee, I think Petra mentioned, you know, if it's too expensive, it's going to discourage content providers from bringing traffic onshore. I think we can have a pretty open discussion on what that means for Europe. I think, you know, there is hosting infrastructure in Europe. There are large European content providers. I don't want to believe that they would suddenly like do tromboning, you know, and go and put their traffic somewhere else for European telcos to go and get it. But, you know, it's happened before, right? So I think we have to kind of be mindful of the fact that certain forms of commercial arrangements and price signals do cause this sort of unintended consequences. So, you know, it doesn't mean it's not feasible, but it's something to bear in mind. And again, I think look, to me, I think I go back to what I was saying earlier, the structure of the internet, and I take your point around the fact that, you know, IP interconnection has changed, right? But really even an embedded cache is still, you know, is still an IP connection within, you know, closer to the end user. So it's just the interfaces are more decentralized, but that to me seems like a good thing, right? It means that, as Petra was saying, there's less traffic going onto more traffic sensitive parts of the network. And just to conclude, I think the issue with frictions and the change in incentives is something that, you know, if we are going to progress towards an outcome where there is what I think will be a regulated fee, I take your point that it's not what you're advocating. We need to think about what those frictions mean. And maybe just another thing, I know it's not really the focus of the discussion, but I still think there's some confusion as to why those fees are required. I think what we've heard is a combination of, well, telecoms operators' returns are too low, and therefore, but, you know, that doesn't seem to have disincentivized investment. So how does that, you know, how does that work? We've heard about the 2030 connectivity targets. You know, personally, I think that some of the issues and some of the gap that may remain will be largely a demand gap. So until there are compelling reasons to have 5G coverage everywhere, including in rural areas, it's hard to see how that can work, right? I mean, the incentives, the telecom operators don't have the incentive to deploy, and there isn't the money to support that investment. And just on this, today, as far as I know, happy to be corrected, but those policy ambitions in the 2030 digital decade objectives are not implemented into strong regulatory or legal requirements on operators outside of incentive-based models, effectively. So, you know, obligations associated with spectrum when you choose to bid for the spectrum, or conditions attached to public funding. And there is quite a lot of public funding already spent, right? I mean, if we look at France is a good example, Spain to an extent for very outlying areas, and there's more earmarked. So of course that comes with strings attached in terms of what you do with the money. I think it'd be interesting to also hear from Ethno and GSMA members what sort of commitments they may be willing to make in terms of how the money will be used. And I think we still have this confusion as to why it is required. And you know, I think Bart mentioned made an equivalence between the cost of traffic and the bill of operators. I think, in addition, one additional thing that I always find a bit imprecise is that some of the analysis that's available, for example, from Frontier Economics, apportions fixed costs to the cost of traffic, which, you know, is fair enough in many circumstances, but for interconnection has largely been excluded from the cost base allowable. So for those of you who have long memories, the mobile interconnection debate moved from effectively a fully allocated cost to a pure long-run incremental cost of variable traffic-dependent element. So you know, the traffic-dependent part of the cost today in the existing network footprint is really quite small.
Any questions from the floor in the room? Anyone want to ask our panelists anything because they want to stand up and ask it rather than use the tool? Yes, I see one hand going up here and another here. And we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. We also have a couple more online. And if you could indicate who the question is to as well.
Yeah. So my name is Anna Bigot. I work for Bouygues, and I have a question for Kostas regarding the BEREC response to the public consultation. So as you stated yourself several times now during the debate, the main focus was still on interconnection, which represents 5% of our incremental costs. And less focusing on the other parts of the networks, mainly what we'd consider as being the biggest problem is the access part. So, you know, more the RAN, the base stations, to make it in a simple way, which represents 75% of our incremental cost. So do you think there could be reassessing of BEREC, taking, having a view, a bigger picture of the whole system? Because today, when telecom providers are talking about like investment gap and the problems to reach the digital decades goals, the problem is absolutely not about interconnection. The problem is more about how to deal, you know, very well, how to deal with the traffic and how to deal with the traffic means, especially for the mobile networks, more base stations. And that is where the main cost lies. So we think that's where the assessment should look at. So I would be interested to have your view on that.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Indeed, our preliminary work focused on IP interconnection, and our preliminary assessment report published in October focuses on this part and says that we do not identify any issues in this part of the network. And also, we had this evaluation of the sending party network base model and came to the conclusion that this would harm the internet ecosystem. On the other hand, we recognize, despite the fact that we can have contributions from different stakeholders in different parts of the network, we identify that the access part is the most cost demanding, as you say. This is true. We have not done any investment gap analysis ourselves. We have received the consultation data by the Commission very recently. We will analyze to see if there are quantitative data and solid data. And as we mentioned in our position paper published in May, we will probably assess or reassess our positions if some data, some quantitative analysis indicates that we should clarify or refine our position. So this is with regard to this part of the question.
Thank you. Another question.
Thanks. Tony Shortall from Telej. So I had two questions. So the first is for Kostas, which is on the data you were quoting about, sort of from the observatory report, 71% last October, and they published another report in April, which is 82% coverage. And also then you quoted 51 or over 50% for fiber coverage, which was 2021 data. It's now 63%. And in fact, that coverage is moving twice as fast in rural areas as in urban areas. And so my question is, it's moving very fast. You know what I mean? So I suppose I'm a little bit curious, you know, do you not think it's moving fast enough? Or do you think there's more capacity to make it move faster, or that there's a major breakdown? Because it seems to me we're going to be maybe not 100% hit the targets, but we will be very close. And to the extent that we do miss targets, I think it's likely to be in specific countries. So Germany is quite far behind, for instance, in the fixed targets. So that's country specific, policy specific, maybe network specific, rather than a generalized issue. So that was the first thing. The second question is for Bart, which is on the IP interconnection negotiations, because my understanding is that there are negotiations. What you would expect, to go to your point, David, what you would expect and what the Commission tried to recreate with Pure Lyric is a kind of a marginal cost type pricing, okay? And what you would expect in a competitive market is marginal cost type pricing. Marginal cost type pricing in network industries is asymptotically approaching zero. So very often you won't collect the fees. It's just that the negotiated fees will be so low, it's not worth anybody's time billing them or collecting them. And so it's not that there's no negotiation, there is negotiation. And very often, like Telefónica, I guess, collect a lot of fees from people resulting from those negotiations, but most people probably don't, because they don't have the billing engines or the, you know, the measuring systems and what have you. So yeah, so the question is, you know, there are negotiations, it's just the resulting prices are so low, it's not worth collecting.
Okay, Kostas, you can take the next one and then Bart.
Well, Tony, I agree. I mean, there is an improvement and there is a fast pace, improving coverage in both types of networks. I mentioned data of October 22, but it improves. That's why I said that we will see even better data. But a couple of comments. With regards to 5G, coverage is improved, is above 80% now, as you said, but I would also look other quality issues with regards to 5G networks. For example, number of standalone base stations, not using dynamic spectrum sharing, so we can exploit the full potential of 5G. And maybe this is a point that Europe can improve. It's not only just coverage with 5G services that are offered through dynamic spectrum sharing. So we need to exploit the full potential of this. With regards to fiber, I agree we are now above 60%, but we have some specific targets by 2030. So this is the starting point for the discussion, that by 2030, we need to achieve all these 100% coverage. And even more than that, penetration is also important. So we have the networks, we need to look at the demand side, and we need to see how we can improve on this side as well. And there are differences between member states. You mentioned that. I can give my country as an example, which is worse than Germany, maybe. So it's not the same everywhere. On average, yes, indeed, we see a very good pace. I'm not certain whether this pace will continue until 2030 and achieving this 100%, but there is indeed a good pace, but there are a few more details to look in this analysis.
Bart, there are negotiations, but in some cases, they're just not worth it.
Yeah, so coming back to how we connect to the internet, there's basically in two ways. So we procure IP transit services from the tier 1 networks. That gives us access to the whole internet. This is a very competitive market. Prices typically declining anywhere between 15 and 30% year over year. And then secondly, we seek peering arrangements. Typically, these are informal agreements with nearby networks. Could either be through an internet exchange or through a private peering, so a direct connection between our network and their network. We hardly move into paid peering arrangements because we should be able to reach any network through these tier 1s, through buying these IP transit services. But also what we typically see is that companies that charge a paid peering fee, that fee is typically a lot higher than the fees that we pay to these transit providers, because that's a competitive market, while paid peering gives me access to one network. So it's a monopoly discussion, which I'll never win. The challenge begins when I cannot reach these eyeball networks good enough through these tier 1 networks. So some networks in Europe deliberately restrict capacity between tier 1 networks and their own access network in an effort to force also these tier 1s to pay for sending traffic to their end users. And that's really where our challenges are. And I think the same applies probably to Petra, that some networks are really hard to reach unless you really pay a fee, which is 5 to 10 times higher than what you would pay to reach the rest of the internet. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Anyone else in the room with a question? I don't see any hands, which is good because I've got 3 remaining questions for the 3 remaining panelists. This is perfect. So Petra, let me turn to you. I mean, feel free also to comment on what you've heard so far, but how should we classify the data which is the result of cloud services managing and working data on behalf of their customers? Who should pay? What are we thinking around that?
Sorry, could you repeat the first part of the question? Because I didn't really.
How should we classify the data which is the result of cloud services managing and working on behalf of their customers?
Okay, maybe it's more a question to the cloud provider to me than to me. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think also as Carlos has mentioned, also in the presentation from David, you know, if you're talking about data and who is generating the data in the context of the large traffic generators discussion, then it's the customer of either the cloud provider or the CDN that generates the data or that creates the data, that owns it as well. And those other providers, such as specifically talking, obviously, I can talk about the CDN perspective mostly. We are intermediaries to try to help, you know, deliver that content to the eyeballs, to the users that are usually the customers of the telco networks. So it's not that we do anything with that, you know, with the content of a website or, you know, whatever it is, or an application or anything that is being sent to a telco network. We try to provide faster access and more higher quality access for anybody who wants to retrieve the traffic from our caches. But a cache is a copy of what the original customer has created, basically, as in terms of, if we're talking about data as a concept, which I don't know exactly now how they mean it in this question, but and I don't know if Bart wants to comment maybe more about that from your perspective. But
yeah, I think that there's different types of data, obviously. There is data, cacheable data, typically video files and so on, which are perfectly distributed via CDN. And there's, of course, data which needs to be kept private, say in one place, which is definitely not cacheable. So this is more, where business applications tend to use our cloud services to host their application, but then we make sure that it really stays in one place and it's only subject to the local legislation in terms of privacy and security and so on. I don't know if it addresses the question because I really was struggling to understand.
Again, I didn't write this question. So we have another one here. I'm not sure who it's directed to, but it says telcos are more active in the CDN and cloud markets than before. So Orange, for example, launched a new CDN in France. How do you see the implications of this trend in the context of this debate? Carlos, do you want to take that one?
Yes, thank you. So one point that I forgot to mention, and it's good that the question brings this up. True. I mean, we have on net CDNs, we have a number of agreements with a number of companies on the use of these mechanisms. What I think is important to notice is the way we see the debate approaching. There are different architectures and different ways of delivering the content to us. Companies that have installed CDNs under an agreement with us are under a very different situation than companies that, for instance, deliver the traffic to us on one single point at national level. So when you go to the commercial negotiation that we are envisaging, they are foreseeing, that definitely should play a role in terms of counting on the effect of those previous agreements. So it's an important point. Can I quickly address 2 or 3 points from Daniel? So Daniel, on your point on why this is not a problem elsewhere, I think on the contrary, this is a global conversation, independently of whether you have an open internet regulation or not. We do believe that with the open internet regulation that we are happily complying with, and is not a problem on this matter, but it's the reality. We cannot block, we cannot throttle, we cannot discriminate. We're happy to do so, but we don't have any leverage, let's say, in this negotiation to say this is the consequence if you don't pay me. That's why we think is the factor that triggers a regulatory intervention, among others. In other places, I don't know, it may be that in the US, some payments are happening that are not happening in Europe. Or it may be that the conversation is about a different thing, such as the Universal Service Fund mechanism and how to make a contribution to that fund. But the conversation, I think, is global, independently of the open internet regulation. On the pricing signal and the consequences, I think the opposite way is our thinking. So if we introduce the mechanism, there will be a strong incentive for these companies to go below the threshold. And the effects will be net positive for everybody, because there will be less traffic pumped up, or less useless traffic, because a lot of traffic is not really that useful. It's just posted up as autoplay videos or advertising mechanisms, not really directly demanded by the end user. So there may be more rationality, and therefore also from a green perspective, it may have positive consequences of the effort to go below the threshold, and therefore not having to pay. On the accountability point, ready to have that conversation. And I think that the track record of our industry shows that we are an investment industry, and this is what we do. And the investment cycle is not over. I mean, now we have the 2030 targets, but we are starting to talk about 6G. There are all these opportunities associated to the Web3 that I was mentioning before that require an investment effort. So I think it's not a challenge for us to show that this will be invested in a productive way, to the benefit of content providers, to the benefit of the whole ecosystem, to the benefit of the European citizens, and to our own benefit. So no zero-sum game, win-win situation for everybody out of this mechanism being in place.
Well, I am conscious that we've already gone 10 minutes over time, and I see there is one more question here in the room. So if we can keep it very brief, and I will have a final question to David as well.
Thank you. This one?
Yep, and then we'll try and wrap up, because I know there's networking and coffee time. Yes.
This one?
Just take all this. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Yves Blondel. I have a small consulting company that specialized in telecom regulation. My question goes to Carlos first, but maybe the others can respond thereafter. And it concerns the final offer arbitration mechanism that you're putting forward. I have a question about the transparency associated with that, or maybe not associated with that. So if once the system that you demand is being put in place, you reach a commercial agreement with some hyperscaler, some large traffic generator, presumably that agreement would not become public. If you require the final offer arbitration and the final offer arbitration has an outcome, would that outcome become public? And that is a bit of a question, like, who is the arbitrator? Is that a pan-European arbitrator? Is that a country arbitrator? Is that a case-by-case arbitrator? And how many arbitrations are we envisaging in this world is I think, a related question. And so I wonder whether we would move in that environment to a much less transparent system than, for instance, the one we know for wholesale mobile call termination rates, or for other elements that are subject to a cost model that has been discussed, that has been agreed, etc. So the question is really on the transparency aspects of the final offer arbitration.
Yeah, and Carlos, if you can keep it quite brief.
No, sorry, just to mention that we see this as a development on a per market, national market basis, precisely because of the point that I was making before, that the architectures that these large traffic generators have on the different markets within the EU are different. So this means that the structure and the negotiation would be different on a per market basis, and has to be, let's say, from the arbitration perspective, dealt with a competent authority at national basis, in our view. The incentive for the parties to negotiate in good faith is that this mechanism of final offer arbitration implies that with the guidance from the European Commission, we believe you have a set of criteria that allow you to determine which is the right offer. There is an incentive to behave rationally. The large traffic generator would not say my offer is 0, because that is not rational. And we would not say my offer is 10 billion, because that is not rational. So we would have an incentive to find a common ground. And then those criteria that would be, of course, public, would allow the arbitrator to make the choice between those two offers.
Well, thank you. And thank you all very much for the questions, including the last one online, which I'll put to you, David. You started off the panel, so you're going to have the unenviable chance of kind of wrapping it up. And it's quite a question. It's let's imagine the SPMP scheme is introduced in the EU. Don't we just push all the caps and their server locations out of the EU into the UK? I don't know who asked that question, some anonymous person.
I promise I didn't ask it to myself. Maybe some of it. I think, I mean, it's kind of difficult. I think I would like to perhaps just answer with you know, kind of thinking about what Carlos just said. I think if the regulation, arbitration, pricing is on a national basis, I can sort of see the same sort of forum shopping and arbitrage happening as perhaps has happened with data protection in the past, right? So markets who have existing data centers where there's, you know, sunk investment by those large companies, you know, having an incentive to keep that investment and so forth, and therefore striking a deal where the interconnection is very, well, it's free, or, you know, whatever the end is. I think anything that's, so just perhaps to try and answer in a structured way and link with the previous question on telecoms operators offering cloud and CDNs. I think any such fee that's going to be way in excess of cost is going to create distortions. So it's either going to create scope for cross subsidies, self-preferencing, or tromboning and avoidance. So I think we can even, I would like to make this point sort of irrespective of whether I agree with the concept or not, right? I think it's, if we project ourselves towards a workable solution for what is being suggested, we'll have to deal with all these issues. And I think that goes a bit in the same direction as Yves said. So yeah, I mean, look, I don't know if there's going to be large scale tromboning, but it's certainly what happened before. But here we have a situation where there's already very large amounts of traffic being exchanged. I think Carlos also mentioned that maybe different content providers should be treated differently depending on where they interconnect and so forth. I mean, I think it's quite notable, without kind of revealing anything confidential, but the companies that are being called large traffic generators in this debate, at least, well, I think a critical mass of them, at least that I know, already exchange traffic in very many locations in nearly every European markets already today. And so, you know, if you're going to offer a different price for that compared to one national interconnection point, then actually you're swapping the focus, right, between large and small players. So again, things to, I think, articulate maybe more clearly and work out over the coming months.
Well, thank you, David. I mean, you've said it. We're not going to solve everything in a 90-minute panel, and I think we could probably, we've gone over time. It would have been lovely to have a commission representative on the panel, but then we would have been here for even more hours, and I'm stressing out about missing coffee. So thank you all very much. Thank you very much to the audience online and to those here in the room for all your questions. We tried to get to as many as possible, but as they say, this one is going to run and run. So watch this space. Thank you all very much, and a big warm round of applause for our panelists.